And we welcome you here this afternoon for a very interesting program. Mission of KEI is to promote dialogue and understanding to advance all aspects of the relationship between the Republic of Korea and the United States. Today, KEI is privileged to co-host a panel discussion with the Korea Society analyzing the results of yesterday's parliamentary elections in South Korea. I'm a former member of Congress, having served 20 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, including 6 years as the Republican leader of the Asia Subcommittee. We have a great panel lined up for you this afternoon. They are experts on Korean domestic politics, and they possess a deep knowledge of understanding of how this election process relates to the U.S.-Korea relationship. This discussion is a follow-on to a panel hosted last week by the Korea Society and KEI, where KEI Vice President Mike Tokola participated, giving a preview of the National Assembly elections. And today you can talk about a review of the elections. Election results are not always predictable. I should know. I was there for 20 years. We see this in many countries across the world, including, of course, the United States. That is the wonder and marvel of the secret ballot, giving power to the people to decide who will be entrusted with the great responsibility of governing. We look at and admire the democratic process in Korea and how it has rapidly developed over the last 3 decades. Again, welcome and thank you for coming to today's discussion. I turn it over to our moderator for today's event, Mark Tokola, who served for 38 years in the State Department, including 3 years as Deputy Chief of Mission of the U.S. Embassy in Seoul. Mark is our Vice President. He'll introduce today's panelists. Look forward to your discussions.
Thank you, Congressman. Welcome to KEI. We always pride ourselves in putting on timely and relevant events, but today's may be a record, as we're here to discuss the results of an election that took place 48 hours ago. We can only do that because we have an expert and experienced panel with us. You have their bios in your handout, but just to present the cast of characters, we have Bruce Klingner, who's a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia in the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center, and one of the most listened to voices in Washington on the Korean Peninsula, both north and south. Then next to him, we have Stephen Norper, who's senior director for policy at the Korea Society in New York, an adjunct fellow with the Pacific Forum, CSIS. We're delighted to have Stephen with us, even though it means he's missing out on some of the advertisements in New York for the presidential primary while you're with us. Then Troy Stangarone is our Senior Director of Congressional Affairs and Trade at KEI. Along with a strong Korea background, he has experience to draw on of having served as a staff member to a U.S. Senator and having been involved in election campaigns. So the basics in the Korean political system are the National Assembly is elected every 4 years, and the president every 5 years for a single term. Because they're staggered 4 and 5 years, the two elections sometimes take place the same year, as they did in 2012. So in 2016, we've just had National Assembly election, and the presidential election will be in December 2017. So President Park Geun-hye still has a year and some months to go. There are 300 members of the National Assembly. This time, 253 were elected in district elections, and 47 by proportional voting. Bruce, even before we look at results, for a start, could you talk about the state of play prior to the election? What would you say about the last National Assembly? What was this election about?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. But just to point out to people, you may not be able to tell, but each of us have a different colored coaster. And so I think I will be providing the People's Party viewpoint. Steve will be providing scenery, and Troy is
the independent candidate.
You're purple, yeah, and Mark is the blue.
Blue from Washington State.
Right. Anyway, the election, the message from it, people, it's going to be whatever you want. Was it a mandate on President Park herself, her style, her aloofness, her, what's portrayed as authoritarianism? Is it a referendum on her policies? Is it a referendum on the seigneurie and the infighting, which the other parties also had? Or is it really none of the above and sort of a pox on both your house? We want to, go for a third party. It's sort of all of the above and none of the above. So I think the election was less about issues and more about the infighting within both major parties. And so in that sense, perhaps it was less a case of who is more capable, more charismatic, and it was maybe a case of an election of who is less disorganized, less chaotic, less pitiful.
All right, let's look at the numbers. Let's put the slide up, please. And we have our numbers slide. There we are. So you'll see that the center-right party, Saint-Nary, now in second place, lost 35 seats. So now it's at 122. So the Saint-Nary is now not the biggest party in the National Assembly for the first time in 16 years. Center-left Minju on top there has 123 seats, but lacks a majority because the total assembly is 300. The People's Party, which split off from Minju only last January, holds the key to forming a majority of the new National Assembly with 38. So some other numbers are that 44% of the members of the National Assembly are freshmen this time, and fresh women, newly elected for the first time. The percentage of women in the National Assembly is up slightly, from 7.7% in the last one to 10.3% in this assembly. The voter turnout for this election was 58% in South Korea, the highest since 1996. There was a particular increase in voting among the youth, 20 and 30-year-olds, up 12% in the 2012 election. So I'm going to start by asking all of you, starting with Stephen, how would you interpret these results? We'll do the details later, but what's your headline?
I think my headline would be something along the line of tech titan may reshape political landscape. Because I think really the most interesting aspect of the story is what happens in terms of the implication of Ahn Cheol-soo's victory here, how he may or may not emerge as a presidential candidate, and where those 38 votes may go through negotiation and perhaps compromise.
Troy, what's your headline?
I would say surprise. I don't think anybody's going to look at, even 3 or 4 weeks ago, people were expecting, maybe 180 Saint-Nary seats. Minju was concerned they would even hit the 100 threshold. There's questions of whether the People's Party would be able to take and really even get to the negotiating bloc size of 20. Instead, we've seen, as Steve said, almost a tectonic shift take place. So I think, surprised. I don't think anybody really expected this result. You could see things heading as Saint-Nary sort of reduced their expectations over the weeks, but I think this is really surprising.
Thank you. And Bruce, your headline?
Saint-Nary takes it in the shorts. It's a technical term. And gridlock on steroids.
All right, we'll get to that. Okay, Stephen, to start with you, what does it mean for the remainder of President Park's term that she's dealing with the National Assembly now with an opposition majority?
Yeah, I think 9 out of 10 articles that you read today in either the Korean press or the foreign press will say that it means really gridlock, as Bruce just alluded to, or gridlock plus. It will be extremely difficult for her to get in to play any kind of further domestic agenda that does not involve an awful lot of compromise on the part of the ruling party. Chae Sung-hoon from the New York Times just put something up about an hour ago that was rather interesting that said that she may gravitate much more toward foreign policy and national security policy because that's the area where she can score gains. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of priorities. But as a referendum in terms of the national elections, the presidential elections next year, it means a very, very difficult road ahead for her.
Okay, Bruce, off-cycle elections are sometimes a chance for the electorate to respond to the incumbent government's policies. Do you think that was the case this time?
As I said, I think it was really sort of less about the issues and more about the mood. Park Geun-hye complained about a vegetative gridlock or vegetative legislature where nothing was getting through. And I think we're just going to have that continue, if not worse. And really, if the legislature has nothing to really show for itself, it's been seen as perhaps the least productive in modern South Korean history. President Park also doesn't have much to show for her presidency. She had reached out to North Korea. That wasn't successful, and I blame Pyongyang, not President Park. She had put a lot of capital into reaching out to China, hoping that would give leverage with North Korea, and that didn't happen. And I think her decision on THAAD was in large part not only a reaction to her anger with North Korea, but also China. And she had put a lot of capital into the history issues with Japan and then had to back off on that. So, and then domestically, I don't think there's a lot of successes there, even though I think there's been, to a great degree, a sort of convergence on the policies of both the left and the right. They seem to be adopting some of the policies of each other. So I think it's more, if not personalities, sort of the politics of it rather than the policies.
Thank you. I should have set the terms of the discussion, I guess. I'm going to address questions to individuals, but if others want to jump in on what was said, feel free. This is an open conversation. So, Troy, do you read this outcome as being based on the policies of the various parties, or was it about personalities? And could you give us a thumbnail sketch of the key players?
Yeah. Well, I think, traditionally, Korean politics has been very sort of personality driven. And I think we're seeing a move away from that. One of the interesting things that I think you can see right now is, Bruce said, if you look through, and we did a post on our blog looking at the two parties' sort of positions, you see a lot of space domestically in terms of policy narrowing. Even if you look at foreign policy, there's a lot of narrowing in terms between the two policies, so they're sort of converging together. But if you look at some of the tensions that you had within both the Minju Party and within Saenuri, you're sort of seeing, I think, a shift. Not only, Steve talked about this tectonic idea of shifts, but I think even within the parties between greater move towards basically institutionalization and those who supported, sort of a process-based system and everything, and those who are still more personality-driven. And, this is one of the tensions going forward. In terms of, the players who are involved, well, we've talked about Ahn Cheol-soo. Ahn Cheol-soo is probably, one of the key people here in the sense that, he left the Minju Party about 2 months before the elections. As soon as he left, shortly thereafter, Moon Jae-in took and stepped aside. Kim Jong-un took over the party. Kim Jong-un had advised Park Geun-hye beforehand. He set up her economic democracy platform. He sort of broke with her when he felt she didn't follow through how he would have liked. He was sort of the architect of the Minju campaign. But you had this sort of tension between the People's Party, Ahn's party, and Minju in the sense of, if we're going to take and ensure that Saenuri doesn't get 180 seats, should we take and basically form an alliance? Ahn Cheol-soo took and resisted that. He let people, if they wanted to on a voluntary basis, do that. But in a party sense, no. So, they kind of were the two driving forces, I think, a lot in this election. And their choices sort of helped to shape, I think, what we saw.
Okay, so I'll go to Bruce, but it kind of goes back to you too, Troy. When you look at the results, one thing you can see is that the opposition didn't get a majority because they split. You've got this gap now between the Minju and the People's Party. So, Bruce, what does happen? Can the opposition parties make a united opposition in the National Assembly, or does that division stay?
Right. Well, I mean, as we saw, a lot of infighting and rebellion and defections from both Saenuri and Minju. And now with Ahn Cheol-soo, he's sort of the man of the hour, as he was sort of prior to the last presidential election before he sort of flamed out. I mean, the question now will be whether he is a powerhouse or a power broker or powerless. One of the quests for him was not only to get a certain number of seats, but also to get them outside of Honam. And because the People's Party did well in Honam, it really displaced Minju. So, Minju then did well in Seoul and Gyeonggi province, but will Honam now see Ahn Cheol-soo as the successor to Kim Dae-jung, or will they see him as, you split the progressives. We could have had a huge majority had it not been for you. So I don't know. I don't know how Honam will react, whether they'll embrace him as their new leader, or whether they'll go to someone sort of more traditional, Moon Jae-in or Chung Dong-young or others from sort of the older days. But I think we're still going to have kind of a pro-no Myuhan, anti-no Myuhan a disparity in the progressive movement. And if Ahn Cheol-soo goes back to Minju, then he loses really his purpose. In some ways, his quest is kind of a vanity project. So if he simply goes back, then he's more of a rebel without a cause.
It may be for people who don't follow South Korean politics closely, we should talk about regionalism in South Korean politics, why that matters. So we'd like to take that one on.
I think Troy and I'll go ahead.
Okay.
Well, I guess, just briefly, I mean, Bruce has sort of been talking about this, that, basically you have the two major parties who've over time evolved, changed names, but basically have regional strongholds. And so, you've had both this personality-driven system and one based on regionalism. And so that's been one of the challenges. But I think, looking forward, and Bruce kind of touched on this somewhat, talking about what we can expect to see in the National Assembly. And I think this is where, what to me, as somebody who, having worked in politics, I tend to follow elections all around the world. What I find fascinating about this one, and Stephen, and I'd be interested in his comments on this too in a moment, sort of talked about these shifts, is that, if you look at where the parties won and what the options they have going forward now in the National Assembly are, there's a couple different things. One, Bruce talked about this, this idea of gridlock. If you look at the numbers, nobody has a majority. How do you find a way to pass anything through the National Assembly if you don't have some kind of modus operandi between the parties? So that's, the first option. The second option is, like I said, you've had this policy gap between the two major parties narrow. Could you see something like and this would go outside of the Korean historical political context, but something to the effect of a grand coalition between Minju and Sunuri to where they sort of split their differences on some things and try to work through policy to make the National Assembly work. That would be sort of the German model, if you will. But what is interesting here, and this is what Bruce talked about, is basically Ahn Cheol-soo is now in a very unique and interesting position in the sense of that, I kind of look at him as sort of like, for those of you who know, the Nick Clegg of South Korea. So Nick Clegg was the leader of the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom. The prior national or parliamentary elections in the UK, David Cameron had won a plurality but not a majority of the seats in the parliament. And Nick Clegg held the balance of power. Whoever he went with, if he'd gone with Labour, who the Lib Dems were traditionally sort of associated with, or the Conservatives, would have been in control of the government. What ended up happening is he decided that they could no longer be a protest party. Cameron had the nominal mandate because he had won the majority of seats, and so therefore he went with the Conservatives. It did not work out well for Nick Clegg in the end. The Lib Dems lost many of their seats in the next election and have now become a very small force in the UK politics. So where does this leave Ahn Cheol-soo? If, as Bruce said, he goes back to the Minju party, it raises questions of, why did you leave to begin with? Should we just have one united force? So if he sides nominally with the Minju party in the National Assembly, you have these questions, I think, that come up, and it goes against his sort of desire to create this third centrist political force. But if he goes with the Sunuri side, then he has a situation of, well, how do those people who voted for him in the National Assembly elections feel about that? If you look at some of the proportional representation votes, it looks like they were actually able to pull off some of the conservative vote. So he does have perhaps some base there, but Honam is really the center of the party now. And so he has this conundrum. Do you try to become sort of a national centrist party, which means you probably need to break away more from the Minju side? Or do you take and go sort of back into the fold, realizing that you have sort of a solid majority there? And I think sort of whether you have gridlock, whether the two major parties decide to work together, or whether Ahn Cheol-soo decides to try and be this sort of tipping balance force and how he does it, will sort of determine what happens in the next National Assembly.
I think that's very interesting, and if I could just maybe add a footnote, in maybe when we get to this part about comparisons or indications via the United States, one of the things that Don Kirk points out today in an article in Forbes that's very interesting is sort of the Bernie Sanders aspect of Ahn Cheol-soo, which is another kind of interesting invocation, but in particular about the idea of taking on big systematic change. And so I would back us up just a little bit from the comments that we've all made, as interesting and valid as these all are. I would encourage us to maybe move away from a little bit of our tendency to do what we do in Washington and New York and Boston, which is to talk a lot about top-down and decision-making and the politics of the situation, and to start with a very basic question. What was the South Korean voter telling us today? What was the South Korea voter telling its leadership today? And I think that's really extremely important, and perhaps important in a way that we haven't seen since the 2002 elections, the presidential elections. And that's that the South Korean voter is saying, first and foremost, it's about domestic economics and concerns that we have about the viability, about the fact that it's jobs, 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 to invoke 1994 U.S. presidential sloganeering, but it is about jobs. It's about 12.5% or whatever estimate you want to have of youth unemployment, and it's probably much larger than that because of the number of graduates who come out without job security. It's about household debt. It's about concerns on other economic factors and some that are impacting Korea, like China's economic slowdown. And so that creates a tremendous level of insecurity. And I think that's what the South Korean voter is really telling us, that that's not acceptable, that progress among the leadership has not been made on these fundamental issues. And whereas Sonori banked on national security as being a primary driver, especially the very valid concerns about North Korean activities and provocations, that's not what's in the mind of the Korean voter. These other issues are. And so in that sense, it tacks much more to a broader phenomenon, not just in the United States, but actually globally, where we see concern about fundamental economic security, where we see a widening rich-poor divide. And that is very unsettling in South Korean politics, which is very egalitarian. And that then does play into the issue that was asked about regional politics. And what is interesting, just to add to some of what's already been said, is that you did then have this vote from the Southwest that, on Chol-soo's case, certainly supports somebody who was Busan born. So you have sort of a cross-regional phenomenon that's interesting to see. You have the youth demographic, and it's the young conservatives. It's not just the conservatives attack, but really the youth element. So I think some of those elements are really what we should keep in mind, because they're increasingly important, and they will continue to be so as we look forward to next year's presidential elections.
Yeah, there's some polling data that reinforces what you've said, Stephen. When they asked the South Korean voters what issues are most important to them, job creation was the highest. North Korea's pretty far down the list. And when they asked voters what do you look for in a candidate, 40% plus said they were looking for a candidate with dignity, which included the notion of empathy. Understands what my concerns are. Only 12% or so said party affiliation, much less than dignity, and about 2% said experience, which shows a real lack of faith in politicians as a class of people who have been in office and therefore know what they're doing. There's a very much bigger number of South Korean voters now who are in the middle, who don't associate with either party. It's kind of an enlarging, floating middle. And this poll showed, too, that in the US and in South Korea, the same number of voters express faith in their national government, about 34%. So there's a certain problem with the political system.
And Mark, just real quick to sort of like touch on that and what Steve was just talking about. The results we've seen is each of the parties in their regional base has now to an extent been weakened. And the question, when you look at these kinds of things in terms of what type of candidates, what types of issues matter going forward, there's sort of the traditional political model of, okay, we ran an election on this. This is what the people were looking for. This is how we adjust to take and meet those policy needs in the next election. And that's sort of the basic sort of model going forward. But I think when you talk about the Bernie Sanders effect, when you talk about some of these things going on more globally, we're seeing this sort of breakdown in political systems around the world to where new parties rise up, the established parties weaken, and everything. And so I think one of the key questions for at least the two major parties in Korea going forward is, how much of what we saw, the other day is Korea specific and due to the way the parties presented their platforms, and how much of this is part of a broader trend in terms of globally how politics is changing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Stephen, I know you said that the domestic factors were the biggest ones in the voters' minds, but was there a foreign policy debate? Was there differences in policies?
There is. I wouldn't overplay it relative to the economic concerns. And I think that the key phrase that was used in 2012 that won Park Geun-hye the election was economic democratization. That then became creative economy. And I think what Min-ju put up this time was economic democratization. That is still a priority for the South Korean voter. On national security and foreign policy issues, there is disagreement, obviously, in terms of whether the shutdown in Kaesong is helpful, whether trying to not promote negotiation is the way forward, or whether there should be more engagement. But the opposition party did probably a skilled thing in not articulating that much in this election, not to differentiate as largely in this election on that front. And the criticisms were that the Saenuri party was using some of these concerns, in particular the defections of the North Korean restaurant workers to South Korea, the reports of the defection of a high-level North Korean official last year, to try to drum up concern about national security issues. But clearly there's going to have to be some probably conditioning of Park Geun-hye's policy, because she has drawn in now, in light of the nuclear test and the rocket or missile launch, away from that type of engagement. So we will probably see a push, certainly from the opposition, to try to move forward with the North Koreans. Ahn Cheol-soo has talked about economic engagement with the North Koreans. But remember that I wouldn't go with as many reports as I've read today about the likelihood that we will see a softening of ROK policy on the DPRK, because a lot of constrictions are in place. First, you have this egregious behavior and the provocations and what could well be another missile test tomorrow or in coming days. And that creates just an immediate and absolute security concern. And also the vitriol and the personal attacks against Park Geun-hye means that there's only a certain amount of political space within which she can operate, and only a certain amount of give to that equation. So it will be fascinating to see how inter-Korean relations proceed.
Steve's made all the good points, I think, but let me just try to, since I haven't said them yet, let me repeat them. No, I think, picking up on sort of the domestic economy as well as the convergence. With the domestic economy, we've seen the concerns about the high unemployment, particularly among recent college graduates, the economic disparity, the economic democratization, which Park Geun-hye brought in Kim Jong-un to sort of focus on that for her in her campaign, and then he went over to become head of Min-ju after Moon Jae-in. So there is that focus on trying to improve South Korea's economy, and there's disagreements on how to do it. So, there is a divergence. That's not to say that the two major parties still don't have differences, but it is interesting. In the last elections, you had on the domestic economy the conservatives not acting very conservative. It really was sort of both sides competing with who could promise the biggest chicken in every pot. And not only did you have I think it was at the time the DP, accusing the Grand National Party of pulling some of their talking points. You even had the far left UPP, later banned, complaining, wait, you're taking our views too. So you had on the domestic economy kind of a lot of promising free lunches, and each party almost like, well, we'll have more free lunches or bigger free lunches. So there was that trying to address the economic concerns at the time, which I think have only become stronger now. But also I think the election results, even though clearly a slap to Saenuri, also don't necessarily reflect a lot of faith that Min-ju has the combination correct. So I think there's a great deal of concern, but perhaps not a great deal of faith that either of the major parties has the solution. Now, with the People's Party, is that a reflection of simply, let's try something else, a different guy? Will he be a savior to bring in new ideas? I think the jury is still very much out on that. And then also, as Steve pointed out, on the foreign policy side, you had, after the North Korean nuclear and missile tests, you had both Minju and People's Party approving of the UN sanctions, the stronger sanctions, saying they're necessary, they're the right thing. So since, I think, 2010, particularly after the Yongpyeong-do attacks, you saw the progressives moving away from their old policies. Certainly after the UPP was banned, or when it was accused of being involved in this revolt plan, you had the DP or the progressives moving away from their far left position on North Korea. So given North Korea's behavior, particularly in the last 6 years, you don't have that embrace of engagement, of unconditional diplomacy, unconditional engagement like the Sunshine Policy. So I think the progressives have moved toward the center on their North Korea policy. Obviously still differences with the conservatives. Minju and People's Party would want to reopen Kaesong. But also on the right, I think you've seen sort of a moving to the center on adopting some of the what would be sort of seen left of center economic policies.
Okay, Troy, we've talked about the possibilities of gridlock. We've talked about what the parties might have in common, what they'd like to achieve. Can you identify some areas where the government and the opposition might actually want to do the same thing? So there could be progress in this next year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, and Bruce was talking about too, you've seen this narrowing of policy. Both parties campaigned on the idea of taking and raising the minimum wage. It was just simply a question of to what degree. So, I mean, in theory, some type of minimum wage increase should be something you can get done. I think there's probably policy differences between the Saenuri, who had taken and put forward this sort of large labor market reform bill, and the Minju Party. But labor market reform is something that everybody agrees needs to happen in Korea. It's one of the factors behind why you have high youth unemployment, because you have all these people in temporary jobs who aren't able to get into permanent employment, and the businesses don't necessarily have the flexibility they need to take and really sort of, move workers around as they need to. So, there might be some space there to try and find something to pass something on labor market reform. Depending on how the economy goes later this year, there might be need for additional fiscal stimulus. It will become a question then of, what the stimulus looks like rather than maybe whether you have it. There's one other issue which I'm blanking on at the moment. But
maybe youth, because every party said they're going to hire more youth.
Yeah, so I mean, you had the Minju Party basically put out this idea of essentially having, required amounts of youth hires by government and private corporations. I don't know that that's necessarily the solution that someone in the Saenuri Party can get behind and everything, but they had put forward a more incentive-based structure. So trying to find ways, boost youth unemployment, raise the minimum wage, do labor market reform, potentially work on fiscal stimulus. These are all things the Korean economy needs going forward, and all areas to where there seems to be potentially, if they want to, the space to try and work together. But I mean, some of this I think will go down to, and this is the one factor we haven't talked about yet, is what is, President Park's approach going forward? Does she look at the National Assembly now as hostile, or does she look at this as an opportunity? We've talked about how Kim Jong-un has taken and designed the whole economic democratization platform she had. In theory, one would assume that there is some basis for cooperation in terms of similar ideas that the two have. So if they can find a way to take and move forward at least on the aspects of that policy that they both agree on, then there might be opportunities there as well.
Yeah, let me follow up on that a little bit. And for anybody, I guess my bigger question for the audience too is, how much does it matter? Does it matter who's in charge of the South Korean government, how well the South Korean economy does? Or does the economy have a life of its own? That maybe the politics doesn't matter all that much. How important is it?
I think, to a certain extent, economies run themselves. That's an oversimplification from a political science major. But particularly in the U.S., when you have such a huge economy, people have questioned, how much does raising or lowering a rate really has when you have such a huge economy. The South Korean economy is smaller, but you can argue to what degree the government is responsible for an uptick or a downtick. That said, the perception is it's the government's fault or the government's credit. So whoever the incumbent is, if the economy is doing poorly, it reflects poorly on usually the president. They can try to deflect blame onto an opposition party or the legislature. But I think ultimately the president will get the blame or the credit for the economic situation.
And, while there are other factors, and I mentioned China's economic slowdown that will impact Korea tremendously, there do seem to be more fundamental questions at play. We've talked about jobs and potential for youth on graduation. I read one interesting comment today that we haven't felt this level of insecurity since the IMF crisis. Interesting insight. But beyond that, it's other questions, tackling the chaebol, for example, and whether or not there can be serious structural reform. I think many people assumed in 2012 that that's what a large part of economic democratization was about. And that hasn't happened in the time since. So part of Ahn Cheong-sul's appeal is the ability or the call for or the hope for an ability to try to move small and medium enterprise development forward, to try to create an adjustment on really what is a fundamental aspect of the South Korean economy as we know it today, which is the strength remaining of the chaebol. So lots of these kind of things I think will be in people's minds, and what progress can be made between now and next year's presidential elections is a big question mark. Some people who have looked at Korea for an awful long time say you're not going to break that model no matter what promises are made. And I think others in the opposition say, look, there are fundamental issues beyond that of social safety net, of welfare, especially with a grain population, et cetera, that need to come into play. So it's a fascinating time to be looking at this set of developments, and it will be really, I think, a heady period between now and the end of next year when a new president is elected.
And, there's one, I think, sort of interesting underneath the surface issue in terms of when you look at sort of broader market reform and the chaebol and everything. I don't know how many people saw this recently, but about a week or two ago, cacao was classified as a large conglomerate, which then comes with certain distinctions in terms of how it's taken and regulated, and places more restrictions on cacao going forward. And I think cacao did the right thing by saying this doesn't really matter. But I mean, if you think about how new companies like cacao, which seems to be one of the up-and-coming sort of innovative companies in Korea, is clearly not, your standard operating, chaebol. Do you need to take and sort of look at sort of how you kind of define the large conglomerates in Korea? Does that need to sort of be adjusted so that way companies like cacao, when they do rise up, don't face greater impediments and are able to take and continue to grow? So, I mean, this could be one of the issues going forward. Sort of, do we need to even sort of redefine how we look at chaebols and other large companies, and sort of what types of regulations should be on them and what maybe should be looser?
Okay, kind of stay on the big theme too. People tend to overinterpret elections, meaning something major has changed every election that happens. But do you see anything in this election that makes you think that South Korea is shifting in some direction that this election is telling us about?
Do I? I do, and I think part of the reason I base that is that I think if you ask any of the four of us 2 days ago what was likely to happen, we probably would have said there'll be a slight Senori edge here, and I don't think anyone would have called it. And the last time I can remember when none of us got it right was 2002, and the election of Roh Moo-hyun. So I think what people did not understand or properly estimate was the concern that South Korean voters have about economic insecurity. And I do think that's part of a broader phenomenon, but certainly it's also very specific to Korea's case. And so I think we do need to pay attention to that, because it will mean a lot, not just by way of the presidential elections next year, which I've invoked here and my colleagues as well, but I think beyond that. And so, who comes to the fore next year? We already mentioned Moon Jae-in or Ahn Cheong-sul, perhaps somebody who's viewed as a very centrist or benign element like Ban Ki-moon as he leaves his secretary generalship, or others who we may not know of who sort of rise, and what that will mean in terms of South Korean referendum toward the Conservative Party. I mean, it was mentioned at the start here by Mark that this is really the first time in 16 years when the ruling party has not enjoyed the support and has seen a split by the National Assembly. I think we should back up as well and realize that this is the 20th National Assembly election, and that says a lot about where Korea is in terms of its democratic progress, and that this is all part of, as an international relations optimist, I would suggest is a very positive phenomenon. It's up for us in many ways to keep up with the South Korean voter, because I think the concerns they have are much more immediate than those of us in the policy community, perhaps who spend most of their time on issues of North Korean tests or launches tend to focus on. And those voices are extremely important at driving at a national consensus. And why? Because it's that consensus that will see Korea move forward in terms of inter-Korean relations, that will see the South Korea economy continue to prosper, and that ultimately will have to deal with the question of integration or unification with the North, and all of the economic questions and questions about disparities, et cetera, that will go into that process. So getting a fix on where things are happening now is very important, and trying to track that, even if there are not definitive answers, I think at least to raise those good questions and try to see where the system is tacking to and fro. And in that sense, most of us in the room who have worked in Washington have tended to spend a lot of time with the Conservative Party. They know the people in Sainori, and many of those people have been educated here in the United States. And I think if you go around, you'll find that the knowledge of the opposition in this country is much more scant. And so I think it behooves all of us who work in policy and political science, et cetera, to do a good job of diversifying our portfolio and our knowledge base of those who are active in the Korean political process.
I think you're going to get two messages from this election, as really you do from any election. Those who win or are seen as doing better than expectations, will claim a mandate and embrace by the populace of their message, and therefore they should really have the gavel when making policy. The losers or the lower than expectations usually don't say, we've got the wrong message. We have to totally change and adopt the other guy's message. It usually tends to be blaming the messenger, or our message got muddled. We need to do better. So I don't necessarily see that we've seen the pendulum in South Korea's politics shift dramatically from the right to the left. But I do think the South Korean political landscape is a lot more fluid. It's a lot more uncertain and unpredictable, certainly up until the presidential election. So between now and the election, I think what we're going to see is a lot of blaming and flaming and maiming, renaming, gaming, laming, saming, but not taming.
No, you just sound like Kendrick Lamar.
Right. So what do I mean by all that? Well, within the Sainori, you're going to be looking for scapegoats. It wasn't me, it was the other guy in the room. So you're going to be blaming someone else, you're going to be flaming the other people in the party, looking for a way of shifting blame. And you're going to try to maim your other people in your party to, is it were you not Pockish enough? Were you not anti-Pockish enough? As opposed to, were you too conservative or not conservative enough? And as we often see in South Korean politics, if you do poorly, you rename the party. So maybe they'll change from Sainori to, new something. And then the parties and the candidates, or the possible presidential candidates, will be gaming the system. They're going to be looking for how they can position themselves, to get upsmanship on either other people within their party who might be a presidential candidate, or the other one. Steve mentioned Ban Ki-moon. He probably did the best in this election because he was furthest away. And I think he, could go to be either party. I think both parties will be courting him. Both will see him as perhaps a surefire winner. And I don't think it's all that certain that he definitely goes one party or the other. Also, you'll have the laming of the duck. with Park Geun-hye, obviously, there's always the phenomena of a lame duck in the last year of the presidency. I think these election results sort of bring that forward. Certainly, she lost the crown of election queen. The saming is my cutesy way of saying the convergence of policies that I talked about. And then finally, no one will have the magic solution on North Korea. You'll have no taming of Kim Jong-un. The opposition, Minju and People's Party may talk about Kaesong, may talk about dialogue, but I don't think they will be pushing that very strongly. I think, North Korea, if they do another missile test this week or a nuclear test, I think it's just going to affirm, the idea that we've tried engagement. It hasn't worked. Kaesong didn't give South Korea any leverage. So, we're in this for the long haul, and, you can talk about the conditional engagement, sanctions, and military defensive measures. But, North Korea will continue to be the shadow on the north side of the DMZ.
Yeah, it's something I couldn't help observing, too, when I was looking at the news, trying to see how elections were coming along, how much news there was about the South Korean elections. And if you did Google News, there were a raft of articles, quick analysis. There aren't very many countries in the world that legislative elections get all that much news coverage. It's kind of a sign of Korea's growing importance that people did pay attention to it. You did what everyone does, which is turn to the next election immediately. So all election observers go to the next election the day after the last election. So do you want we've already heard your views on the 2017 election. Troy or Stephen, do you want to handicap the 2017 presidential election for us?
Right, I think I've already made a couple comments.
Well, I guess I'd start off with, there's a lot of truth to the political aphorism that 6 months is a lifetime in politics. Any candidate may look good or bad today, but that may change. That being said, clearly Ahn Cheol-soo has a desire to run for the presidency, and he's done a good job of placing himself in position to potentially do that. Though how viable a candidate he is come December of 2017 will depend on how he handles things in the National Assembly, I think. Ban Ki-moon, it's really, I think, a question of whether he wants to run or not. Right now, if you're any of the, other potential, Senator party candidates, it really probably comes down to someone who's being able to find a way to bring the party back together, unify them, and sort of maybe not necessarily rename or rebrand, but at least give them a rebirth, if you will. But one other person who we should probably think about as well is Seoul Mayor Park Geun-hye. This is somebody who's kind of there. He seems to be fairly popular. He's somewhat associated with Ahn Cheol-soo / the Minju Party and everything and all, but maybe has a little bit more of a centrist credential. So he's probably someone else we should be thinking about as well.
I think Troy's observations are great and spot on. I would just point out just a kind of a novelty. The current president will open the 2018 Winter Games. The next president will actually close the Winter Olympics in 2018, which will be fascinating. And it talks about Korea as a host and a hub. You've rightly mentioned, Mark, the amount of attention that this has gotten globally, which says volumes about Korea's importance. Regionally and globally, politically, economically, as a harbinger of democracy. And those are all things that we here in the United States should sit up and admire, respect, and acknowledge. But I do think going forward, maybe something we haven't touched on, and I don't want to go too far off, but there are some structural questions that probably should be asked, and I know that there was a little bit of writing in journals and on the outskirts of the media in the lead up to this election, but what happens in terms of single-term presidencies? Will that ever change? What happens to presidential legacies in South Korea, where that has been a difficult process, to say the least? Secondly, what about this unicameral legislature? Other ones that are similar, Finland, Sweden, they don't get the attention certainly that South Korea has gotten from this. But the suggestion has been made that a bicameral legislature at some point might help rectify some regional concerns, just because it's in essence what we did here with the experiment of trying to get proper representation. And maybe that might get away from some of the disparities and the relegation, traditionally of the Southwest to the backseat politically. An interesting question. So, and what will this ultimately mean for United Korea and the political processes forward? So I think these are sort of mid and long-term questions, but probably worth just mentioning in this context.
That's a good point. It's interesting, if you go to Seoul and visit the actual building of the National Assembly, it's built to be a bicameral legislature. That's why the building's set up, even though it's unicameral.
Yeah, for after unification.
For after unification, that's right. Okay, before I turn to the audience for questions, I should probably ask you what I forgot to ask you that you'd like to talk about. Do we get it all? Bruce first?
I think we did. I guess, I think you'll see particularly Hungary or, progressive elements will be talking about, this was a message about North Korea. The people are tired about the threat of war. This will lead to a softening towards North Korea. But as Steve mentioned, I don't see that. I don't really think there will be major changes, if any, on the policy towards North Korea. Some would say, well, every South Korean president wants a legacy, and that means a summit with North Korea. Lee Myung-bak, he said, and his senior leadership said, we're perfectly happy our legacy being we didn't give in to North Korea. I think President Park is not going to back down. I don't think she's going to, just do anything in order to get a summit. So I think we're going to see a continuation of the North Korean policy. There's going to be no change in the policy towards the alliance with the United States.
Stephen?
I would say questions that are very important to the Korean voter, and we really have to keep our attention on those essentials. What about economic disparities? What about access, jobs, and what about promise for the future in a system that Koreans would find more equitable, because they don't feel that either party largely has played to its advantage. I don't want to overstate that, but I think that's part of the reason why you saw the almost doubling of seats for the PP. And you also saw, we haven't mentioned a number of the Sunuri candidates because of internal ruling camp disagreements go off as independents. And will they maintain their independence going forward? Will they come back into the fold in a different form? And what will that mean for trying to establish a majority? It's very, very, you can ostensibly see a majority if you put together the gains on the two opposition camps and essentially see 161, but that's not even close to 180. So there is no supermajority. It's going to be a challenge to get things through. And so, I think we need to think about the values of the voter and what's important, what it's signaling going forward. And we also need to think about the viability of the process and the challenges for decision making, especially at a time that's critical economically as well as in terms of political security challenges.
I guess the one thing I'd say that maybe we haven't talked about yet is, while this election clearly was not what anyone in the Sunuri Party would have hoped for, there is one interesting tidbit for them, and perhaps concern for the Minju Party going forward, which is that if you look at the proportional seat representation vote, which is done separately, Sunuri and the People's Party tied for the most seats. They got 13. Minju, who won the most constituencies, only got 11. And so, Sunuri, when sort of a broad-based national vote, did better than it looks, and People's Party did very well, and Minju, by comparison, didn't. So there's some interesting things, I think, going on in what the voters did and what they're saying.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn to the audience. Stephen, I'm going to cheat a bit and ask about U.S. politics, just because you're down from New York. You've had a chance to watch all the candidates, probably personally by this point. What would you say to South Korean voters who are trying to follow the U.S. elections?
Well, I think we'd all agree, and I'm sure a number of people in this room would agree that that's probably the number one question we get from most of our international colleagues, be they diplomats or others. And I think as much attention as South Korean population has for the U.S. Political system and debate, and it's tremendous. It's really not the other way around. Maybe over time it will increase a bit, but everybody likes to look and see what's happening with the process here, and I think the same confusion we all have in terms of the messages that are being sent. Think about what if you're sitting in Korea and you're listening and you hear Donald Trump call for a heavier portion of burden sharing, or it's okay to go nuclear. It's okay for South Korea and Japan to go nuclear because it'll counterbalance. Now, people here may be quick to say, well, it's Trump, or just dismiss it. But how does that play to an international audience that looks at the numbers and says, well, it seems like this person's coming out as a standard bearer for the party, or at least reflective of the voters who are casting Republican ballots. One of the things, and we had a session at Columbia last night that was rather interesting that we talked about, was foreign policy as it's defined now by both Cruz and Trump is largely driven by immigration. It's largely driven by concerns, that stem from counterterrorism, et cetera, that relate to that. And so the politics of fear and the concern that we've seen on that landscape, and that has been propagated by the tragedies in Paris, by the tragedy in Brussels, by sort of this misstated concern about walls and barriers to be constructed on the U.S.-Mexico border, defines one part of it. And then you see this tendency in terms of lack of acceptance on the free trade front, on really both sides, on the Republican, but certainly on the Democratic side as well, in terms of questions about labor and questions of equity, put out by Sanders and Secretary Clinton having embraced things like TPP and seemingly at this stage in the game having backed off a bit. And what message does that send then to the Asian political observer? Are there questions about the cohesion of the U.S. leading something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership forward? And if a vote failed, does that signal a similar lack of guarantee on the security front or other, especially with China's rise? I think these are the conditionalities that probably influence a lot of international thought.
I don't usually talk about U.S. politics, but I think my advice for South Koreans viewing the U.S. election would be my same advice that I'd give American voters who are experiencing it. Drink heavily. It makes it seem less dire, and things seem a little clearer when you're bleary-eyed.
And I guess, I might just add one caveat that, and Trump may be an exception because he's probably in his own category of all politicians and everything. But I mean, just remember, Bill Clinton campaigned against NAFTA. Barack Obama said he was going to renegotiate NAFTA. Bill Clinton ended up passing NAFTA. Barack Obama didn't renegotiate NAFTA. There's a lot of stuff that gets said in U.S. campaigns that are done to appeal to a very small, basically plurality of a segment of the population to take and get you to the nomination. If Trump ends up being the nominee and his rhetoric is still the same, well, like I said, Trump's an exception and everything, but pay more attention when we get closer, and then keep in mind that there are institutional factors that will take, and even if President Trump has some of these ideas that will go back to him and say, well, Mr. President, you need to consider A, B, C, and D, and that will hopefully sort of rein him in. So try to keep it all in perspective.
That's a good point. And Jimmy Carter, too, in his campaigning said he would withdraw U.S. troops from South Korea, but he didn't.
Well, he ended up starting the process, but it was, once again, his advisors at the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and others who convinced him of the need to not do this.
Okay, your turn. The questions about South Korean elections, please, rather than U.S. elections.
Please.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Yeon-ho Kim, USKI at SAIS. I think one of the byproducts, if you will, of this election, National Assembly election, is that you don't have any clear front runner when it comes to the upcoming presidential elections. An Cheol-soo, he did very well, more than he expected, but in a way he's isolated in Honam. And Moon Jae-in, he's in a very difficult position to retake his party chairmanship. Kim Jong-un, he still needs to garner more political support from within the party. We still have a lot of Moon Jae-in followers there. And Saenuri Party, Kim Moo-sung, he already said he will step down. And Yoo Seung-min, he's still outsider. And we don't see any clear front runner here. And the Park Geun-hye, he's still in the speculative territory. So my question is, if there is any likelihood you think that we're going to see any coalition among the center-minded politicians from both conservative and progressive blocs, including some renowned politicians who haven't been frequently mentioned so far by the media, but having political reputation good enough to lead that kind of move. Thank you.
Question.
I guess I'd start off, and I mean, I think you're right. There's not a clear front runner who comes out of this. I mean, people will talk about Ban Ki-moon, but we don't know if he even wants to run yet. So, that's a challenge. I think there is also a structural challenge, which gets back to sort of what I was talking about with Ahn Cheol-soo before. You talk about how he's essentially a regional candidate right now. If you end up with a situation to where you have a conservative candidate, whether they end up changing their party name, as Bruce may be suggesting or not, a Minju candidate, and then Ahn Cheol-soo, you run, in essence, basically the chance of splitting the vote and everything. So I think, if you are someone like Ahn Cheol-soo, you need to go through and start establishing, more national credentials and everything, which means you need to take and expand your base out over the next, year or so. If you're someone like Moon Jae-in, well, he had said he would resign if they lost Honam. So, I mean, the question kind of becomes, how does he take and shape this going forward and build support, within the Minju party to do that? And if he does, I mean, there's clearly this rivalry between him and Ahn Cheol-soo. So does that mean they both end up running against each other and make sort of some kind of unified platform, difficult? If you are Kim Jong-un, I think you're right. I mean, this is somebody who's basically just been implanted in the party recently, so I think it makes it difficult, for him going forward. That doesn't mean it's impossible because, he's exceeded expectations, so he should have a lot of credibility, but he's going to have work to do going forward as well. If you look at, the centerese side, some of the potential presidential candidates lost. The one thing I would say is that if you think about, like Barack Obama, nobody really saw him as a viable candidate, for a while. So, when I talk about this idea that, in politics, 6 months is a long time, how things develop over the next year and a half will, one, help shape some of this out, whether, it's possible for Ahn Cheol-soo and Moon Jae-in to run, and whether they can, unify together. It will sort out this issue of whether, someone can sort of rise up within the Centerese party to take over the mantle. It'll also take and start sorting out this question because, at the end of the year, Ban Ki-moon will leave the UN. I'm sure there will be pressure on him at some point, early next year to try and start, deciding, are you going to run, and if so, whom? So I think some of this will shape out, but I mean, you're right. If you look at it today, to figure out how they get there, a year and almost a half from now, there's a lot of work that I think all of them have to do.
Next question, please. We were complete then. I'll make one more point about regionalism while I think of your next question, which is another polling point data. When Korean voters were asked what the biggest problem is facing South Korean politics, 28% said regionalism. It was the highest number for any factor. 24% said politicians who don't do what they say they're going to do after they're elected. So regionalism is still seen as a problem.
Well, along those lines, and with Moon Jae-in, I mean, he said he would retire from politics if Honam didn't support Minju. Well, they didn't. So does he now have to retire forever, including next year's race, as he said, or does he do what Chung Dong-young or Sun Hak-yu did, grow a beard, go to Germany, come back, or do a temple tour, do a temple tour in Korea, and then you're refreshed. Who knows? But I think it just affirms the point that there really is no clear front runner, and I think really it's going to be hard to predict what the Korean political landscape will be. I think we'll see how the National Assembly plays out. We'll also see, who feels emboldened. You have a weakened ruling party. You have the perception of a lame duck president. Now, I think a lame duck president is still stronger than a lame duck National Assembly or a split National Assembly. And then you have an opposition which will feel emboldened. So as much as they may want to address common issues or common concerns, to reveal my cynical aspect, I think they'll there's not going to be a great meeting of the minds there.
It seemed like the polling data was just wrong this time again. The polling was way off, not what expected. Is that because the South Korean polling is not very good, or is it because of the Constitutional Court's redistricting that we couldn't predict the election outcome? What do we think happened?
Interesting thought on the last one. I hadn't thought about that. One challenge that polling faces everywhere is that there's been this switch to where people don't have landlines anymore. They only use cell phones. They don't necessarily answer, and sometimes you have to go through the internet. And so I think some of it has pollsters, because polling means you have to not only get a hold of people and you have to have a representative sample, but you have to also understand that you have the correct representative sample. To use an example, there are certain polls in the U.S. that are better than others, but one thing you can usually see in the ones that aren't is where, if you're looking, how did you proportion out the Republicans, independents, and Democrats, in the district or the state? How did you proportion out, the men and the women? Because if you get those off, even just by like 1 or 2%, it starts skewing your entire sample. And so, these are very difficult, and it's made more difficult by the fact that people have become, in essence, even though we like to think with smartphones, everything, we're more accessible all the time. For pollsters, in some ways, we become less accessible.
The thoughts?
I think we need to see where there was a delay in getting the map redrawn, right? It didn't go through till March 8th. It was about four months behind deadline. So I think people are still assessing what the implications of that are.
Okay. There was a question here, I think.
Hello, my name is Sun Hyung-jung. I'm an intern at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Center. And I have a question about, in this election, local seats and the proportional representation is very different. So it means that who supports Minju or Saenuri in local seats break away in a proportional representation to the People's Party. Which breakaway is more effective to the People's Party's proportional ratio? What do you think about that?
Sorry, could you say the last part again?
So that which parts who break from Saenuri or who break from Minju is more effective to the ratio of the People's Party?
Just sort of looking at the numbers, because all three of them finished on the proportional side fairly close. But if you look at the seat distribution by constituency, in essence, it looks as though Minju underperformed because they finished with less, even though they had more seats. Clearly, and this is what you're getting at, the People's Party significantly overperformed in terms of proportional representation relative to their constituency seats. And it'd be interesting. I haven't seen exact data yet. I just literally saw it was like one line that said that some of the People's Party's support on the proportional side came from traditional conservative voters. So when better data available, it'll be interesting to see if that's the case, and if so, if it was just a small amount or if it was larger. I'd guess it'd be just a small amount since Saenuri overperformed on the proportional side relative to their constituency seats. But this is interesting because what it says is that there is a broader national appeal on the People's Party side, even though they only really competed in Honam and then a couple seats in Seoul.
Scott.
Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. It looks like there were more potential presidential candidates who were damaged by the election than emerged as frontrunners. And it seems like the one person that you all have focused on is Ahn Cheol-soo, but what I'm interested in is, are there any other emerging candidates that we should be looking at now that the field seems to be more clear, who you think would be viable as potential candidates moving forward into the presidential season? Recognizing that if you name them, of course, you'll put the kiss of death on them.
Well,
I think Troy highlighted a few.
Who the Black Swan
I think
candidates.
Ahn Cheol-soo's fate is in his own hands. So I don't think we've put the kiss of death or anything else on him. But I think right now, because if you look at Saenuri and who they had talked about beforehand, it's really hard to kind of get a feel for who it might be going forward on their side. And, in some ways that might be, a benefit to them because that opens the door. Because, right now you're at a point to where you need to sort of reassess, I think. I think Park Geun-hye, the mayor of Seoul, is somebody we should be looking at. But it's also an interesting question because, if you move away from Moon Jae-in and if we go with, Bruce's question or comment about like, what does retirement really mean for him and everything? And, then if you look at Kim Jong-un, is he going to be the candidate going forward? So who on their side would really kind of stand out? And I think at this point, it's hard for me to see, who that person would be if it's not one of those two necessarily. I don't know if you all have any additional thoughts.
I was going to say Mayor Park, but Scott, you spend more time in Korea than the three of us combined. What? Any names that jump to your? Nothing like turning the question back on the questionnaire, but Scott is really a true expert.
I think the field is clear for somebody new to come in, and the question is whether they can capture the role of transformational leader. Two winners who are familiar from the, who are going to be in the 20th National Assembly, who I think deserve to be watched, are Nak Young-won on the Senator side, and Sung Young-gil looks like he's back in the National Assembly now. On the Democratic side.
I just add, two more whose candidacy seemed to die was, former Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hyun and then the former Gyeonggi Governor Kim Moon-soo. So, the landscape has kind of been napalmed, and it leaves open, new faces. But, in politics, do you necessarily want to be the first, prairie dog who sticks his head out? Because then you tend to be the target of everyone else. So, whether any of these new faces will, stick their head up now or wait to see how things go or wait to be asked, again, it's adding to the list of we don't knows.
I agree with that. I'll add one little twist or caveat to it. We're going to have a new Senator leadership, and those leadership elections will probably sort of take and put an imprint on how or who will emerge on their side. And the one thing I'll say is that whoever that new leader is the person sticking their head out first. But if they are successful, they will be probably the leading contender on the conservative side, I would say, because if they're able to take and build party support back up and everything, they're going to be the person people will probably rally around.
Now, being the mayor of Seoul isn't a bad power base. Worked for Im Myung-bak. That's a bad place to start. Other questions? Okay, then thank you all for coming, and let's thank our panelists the traditional way.